Well, welcome to the Big H podcast. This is Mike Heiss, and I'm in here with Conversations with Crumb with our Hilton-Parma Historian Dave Crumb. In tonight's episode, we're going to talk about Parma-Hilton in the Civil War. And I was talking with Dave. Of course, Dave, thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you for inviting me again, Mike. It's good to be here. And tonight we're going to chat a little bit about the Civil War and Hilton. First of all, there were no battles fought up here and no great heroics that we have discovered at the moment, but the vibrations were certainly felt up here. The era of the Civil War in the U.S. was a traumatic time for the nation as the country divided and waged war over slavery and secession. That was the secession of the southern states. Even as far north as Hilton, which was then called Unionville, people were involved and the vibrations were felt up here. Okay, in Parma, we sent 250 of her men into the battle. 25 of them lost their life and never came home to live out their futures. Those that did, most of whom were in the 108th Volunteers in Rochester, joined the GAR, which was the Grand Army of the Republic, much like the VFW and the Veterans of Foreign War of today. These gentlemen met regularly and marched in parades in Hilton and other Monroe County villages, and were celebrated as for their patriotism and for their service in the Civil War. And they kind of influenced the young men of the village. I remember a photograph taken on Main Street in Hilton of the recruits for World War I. And these were the young men of the day back around 1916-17, and they were being reviewed by these Civil War veterans to see if they measured up. It's just a photograph, but it certainly speaks volumes.
Well, how did they measure up? Were they tough like the Revolution or Civil War guys? Or
standing up straight and taking commands, this sort of thing. These old veterans, knew the drill. These young boys were just local boys who wanted to do their thing, but they were paraded in front of these old guys, and somebody called out the orders, and they did an about face or a salute, pulled up their guns, and of course none of them had been to camp at this point. Those boys were no less than men that fought in the Civil War. While it isn't Civil War related necessarily, Glenn Fishbaugh and Harlan Cooper and Kenneth Smith were the first boys to sign up for the World War I in Hilton, and Glenn Fishbaugh, he lost his life. He was the first to lose his life. So these boys were just as good. They just needed the experience. Before we get into too much, I want to just chat a little bit about some Civil War statistics to kind of frame it. And this is on a national scale. I told you how many came from Hilton. The soldiers who enlisted from the North, 2,672,000 men from the North. Soldiers who gave their lives from the North, 360,222. Roughly 13.5% lost their life. Maybe not from being killed, maybe from sickness, disease, or wounds. But these figures are pretty much agreed upon by historians. However, they're always changing because new material, emerges and it changes. Soldiers from the Confederacy in the South, 1,227,890 were in the Confederate unit, and 258,000 of them lost their life, 21%. The Southern soldiers were considered the best. They were fighting for their their homeland. They had better leadership, according to the history books. The North had more support. We had more soldiers. We had more resources. It was a terrible war.
Can you, besides,
Yeah.
why did they give any reason as to why the South had better leaders or better military leaders, or they just flocked there, or did they, you know what I mean? I mean, I think one of the things is interesting. They were fighting for,
Fighting for their homes.
Their homes. Is there any reason given as to why the leaders were better down there?
I think they had better training.
Mm-hmm.
I think many of them were West Point graduates,
Mm-hmm.
the leaders.
Okay.
Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, of course, Robert E. Lee,
Mm-hmm.
and others. I mean, they were better trained. The Northern leadership, Lincoln had a terrible time with them. McClellan, Meade, they didn't want to take the men out into battle. And Lincoln wanted to get them out there and have a confrontation and get this war over with. And they came up with a million excuses why they couldn't do that. And he had to finally change the leadership. Grant, of course, was the successful one, and it was through Grant that we probably won the war. But the more you get into it, you see what a needless loss of life, what a waste of resources, but yet it had to be done to solve the problem. And the big problem was slavery, didn't go along with our Constitution, and the slaves were freed. Just a few other little notes. In one diary I read, the diarist, or the person that wrote it, was a private, and he said 99%, the life of a soldier is 99% boredom and 1% terror. We always hear about the big battles and all the loss of life, the blood and guts and so forth, but an awful lot of time was just spent in camp, drilling and sitting around and just doing, a little of nothing. At first it was fun. A lot of the soldiers from the North, when they signed up, thought they were going to a party or something. These were young boys. They couldn't wait to get off the farm, and they were all excited. Lincoln came out, he called for volunteers. They were patriots. They had recruiters. They had bands. They had music. And it just was the thing for a young boy to do. The parents couldn't object, so they'd sign up and they'd go. But when they got there, they found a completely different situation. And after a year or two, they were totally changed.
Was there an age limit that
But you were supposed to be over 18.
Okay.
And now that you asked that question, there's a little story about a very ethical young man who went to the recruiter, and he was only 16, and he didn't want to lie. So he put 2 notes in his shoes that said 18 in each shoe, and then he said, "Yes, I'm over 18," because he had these notes in his shoes.
Mm-hmm.
That came up in one of the just an interesting little tidbit. Loss of life in battles. I'm not going to go through all the battles, but in Antietam, both sides lost around 22,000. But Gettysburg, that was one of the worst. 51,000 in 3 days. Terrible. If any of you go down to Gettysburg and visit that national shrine, it is eye-opening. And you can tour the battlefields. You can see O'Rourke's monument from Rochester, General James Wadsworth from Geneseo. There's a monument for him. This is, again, getting away from Hilton. There's no monument for Hilton, but many of our men were in the 108.
Why was there so much loss of life there? Was it just such a high concentration of soldiers?
It's the last war where they fought the old European style, where they lined up everybody in front of each other and said, "Go."
Mm-hmm.
And they just fired away at each other, and cannons were going off, and you were supposed to keep down on the ground, keep your head down, and hopefully you'd survive it. But a lot of them didn't. They stood up, and it was crazy. It just and nobody really knew who won. The wars after that were done a little bit more differently, more guerrilla warfare, more not right out there in broad daylight like a football game.
Mm-hmm.
Taking an up-close look into the life of a soldier, I want to recommend the Arthur Newton letters. Arthur Newton was a young man from Parma Center, and he was went to the Methodist Church. He was well educated for the day, and he too signed up and went down to Washington. And he was a private in the New York 108. And he wrote letters home every week. And his sister, or his parents, and then his sister later, saved all those letters. And they passed down through the family into the hands of, Margaret Odell Freeman. And she loaned them to Don Stilson, who was a former historian, and Don transcribed them into a book. I've read that book twice, and it really transports you back into the life of a soldier in the Civil War. And because Arthur was from Parma,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of relate to him. I know where his house was, seen his gravestones up in Parma Union. I know some of his descendants. And so you read this, and his letters are well written, but they give you a sense of what's going on in the life of a soldier. And he would often write home asking his folks to send him new boots because he worn the other ones out, or send me some food, or send stationery, send stamps, things like that, so he could keep writing. He also received letters from them, but his letters those letters that came to him never got saved. So
Mm-hmm.
It would have been interesting to see the other side.
Sure.
Yep. There were many boys in the same units that Arthur was, and he mentions them. And I guess they did this deliberately so these boys would have a sense of home. They'd have some of their friends around them. And he mentions Dennis Tabor. Dennis Tabor lived over on the Burritt Road. And he survived, and Dennis Tabor kept diaries all his life. And then there was Simeon Odell, and he was from Charlotte. I think originally Parma Center, moved to Charlotte. Henry Hoyt was from Hamlin originally, but he moved over to Parma Center. He was Lonnie Rood's great-grandfather. Daniel Hull. Daniel Hull was from Parma, I believe. He would be Todd Pickett's great-great-grandfather. Albert Horton. Albert Horton had a general store on the corner of Main Street and Lake Avenue in Hilton, where the pharmacy is today. Peter Tenney. Peter Tenney owned a big farm over in Hamlin. And later, he survived, but he later grew award-winning peaches, plums, pears that he won silver medals for at the St. Louis World's Fair back around 1900. So these are all people that did survive, and they became prominent people in the community. Lyman Wolfgut was from Curtis Road, and Hanford Bass lived on West Avenue in Hilton, and it was said he always got his flag up before anyone else. Before the 4th of July or Memorial Day. These letters are just a great source of information for the historian as well as the casual Civil War enthusiast. Unionville men or Hilton men who died. I'm not going to go through them all, but one was Dexter Burritt. He was age 26. He was from the 13th New York Volunteers. He died in 1863 from sickness in the hospital. He was the son of Seeley and Sophia Burritt of Burritt Road. Charles Stoneman was 19. He was a private in the New York Volunteers. He was wounded in the arm, killed in battle. Brian Knowlton, age 20. He was in the old New York 13th, and he was killed in battle. There were in total 25 in our record. In the 1920s, Hilton's old veterans would celebrate each other's birthdays together. The framed photo hangs in the Parma Hilton Museum showing Robert Haslip, Gilbert Warren, Henry Buffton, Henry Woodhams, Hanford Bass, John Way Sr., and Asa LeBaron, all old men by 1920, but they would get together for their birthdays and chat about their days in service. I grew up next door to John Way Sr.'s son, John Way Jr., at our summer cottage at Hilton Beach, and he would tell me about his father, a few Civil War stories. He also said his brother, Wally, had his uniform over in their house over in Hamlin. I was always curious about that, never did hear what happened to it. Robert Haslip lived over on the Manitou Road on the Greece side, but he signed up in Hilton. Henry Woodhams was a ancestor of Ray Hendershot's wife, and Gilbert Warren was Parma's last veteran, and he died in the 1930s. Another interesting memoir was by Ira Cross. Ira Cross lived down at Bartlett's Corners. Where is Bartlett's Corners? Well, it's the intersection of Curtis Road and North Avenue. Later, people remember it as Chilson's, and then even later as Joe's Diner. And now there's a new place, a restaurant there called the North to the South. But the real name was North Parma until that was taken up to Hilton, and Unionville was called North Parma, and then Old North Parma had to find a new name, so they called it Bartlett's Corners. But anyway, Ira was about 10 years old in 1861, and he lived just up on top of the hill on North Avenue, and the house on the right. His family had settled there in 1811, first arrivals. And he was the grandson of old Elihu Cross, who was the first settler. And down in the northeast corner, where the road intersects, was an old stone church, cobblestone church. It was built in 1847. And that's where they did the recruiting. And Ira was there. And he gave this memoir to Charlie Cooper, who was editor of the old Hilton Record. And they printed it back in 1936. I got a copy of it and read through it, and very interesting. I think it's also published in Shirley Houston's book, Parma, the Hub of the Universe. So there's Ira, 10 years old, sitting up in a deep window seat in the inside of the church. The church was filled. Outside, they'd had a parade of the Wide Awakes. Who were the Wide Awakes? Well, they were a political group who were against the, they wanted slavery to be ended, and they would march around with torch lanterns in the night with costumes, and also they had a band that played a lot of spirited and energetic music. A recruiter was in the church, which was then filled. He said President Lincoln was calling for volunteers, and they needed to get the volunteers as quickly as possible. That night, 13 young Parma men signed up to go into the service, none of them having previous service. The names of those fellows that Ira Cross remembered were John and Jasper Van Court. I think they lived down on Mariah Street in Hilton. Daniel Meach, he lived down on the Bennett Road. Joe Heffer, Theodore Sands, is an ancestor of Danny Smith's. Manly Herrick, Henry Teller, Robert Haslip, William Morris, George Raymond, Peter Tenney, who we mentioned before, and Francis McDougall. Some of them went into the old 13th, which we've mentioned, and others into the 108th. But Raymond and McDougall both went into the sharpshooters. Ira remembered how anxious everybody was back home here in those difficult years. In 1865, President Lincoln was shot by Southerner stage actor John Wilkes Booth. The nation went into mourning. Elias Curtis of Curtis Road saved his copy of the daily newspaper that covered that event. The Curtises left it behind when my family purchased the farm in 1948, and I still have it. The columns were draped in black. That was a very sad time in history, in the nation's history, because Lincoln had put his heart and soul into this war and to solve the problem. And he was also very concerned about getting the South back on their feet once, now that they were back in the nation again. And his death, created quite a vacuum for quite a few years. On a new note, in the 1940s and 50s, the last Union combat veteran of the Civil War lived in Rochester. His name was James Elbert Hard, and he was a pension attorney in the Reynolds Arcade on Main Street. And he secured pensions for over 5,000 veterans and their widows during his career. Remember, before 1938, there was no Social Security. And so when these veterans got to be up in their late 60s and 70s and they had to discontinue work, they still needed to eat, needed an income. And so worked hard to make sure that they were able to get their due in pensions. And it was really hard back in those days. You really had to show a lot of affidavits and have every I dotted and every T crossed and so forth. Anyway, Hard retired at the age of 87 to go home and take care of his ailing wife. But then, astonishingly, he lived another 25 years. Those years were spent being active in GAR encampments. Remember the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. That was the veterans group. Around 1949, he was proclaimed the last living combat veteran. However, Albert Wilson in Duluth, Minnesota, did survive him, but Wilson was only a drummer boy and never seen combat. Hard enjoyed his status as the oldest and finally last Union veteran. He rode in many Monroe County Memorial Day parades, including several in Hilton. In 1949, a gentleman on Main Street touched me on the shoulder and said, "David, look out there and see that convertible going by. You know who that old man is in there?" I said, "No." He said, "That's James Hard. Take a good look. He's the last Civil War veteran."
Incredible.
And since then, I've been most interested in the history of this gentleman. In fact, I got to meet his great-great-grandson, who lives in Parma now, about 15 years ago. And we chatted, and I said, "Oh, I remember seeing Mr. Hard in this parade." And he said, "Oh, that's interesting, because I was born after he died." And I said, "Well, I can't tell you much, but he was in the newspaper all the time. He was a social luminary. Everybody in Rochester was interested in him. He played his role like the good celebrity. They have a birthday party for him every year at the Seneca Hotel. They put 110 candles or whatever age he was on there, and he'd blow them all out. And he was quite a person. He never proclaimed any heroics, but he gave lots of first-hand accounts of many of the battles that he was in. And we don't have time tonight to go through all those, but I do give a program on James Hard, and I've given it to about 20 groups around Monroe County, because today just about everybody's forgotten who he was. Back in the 1950s, 60s, maybe the 70s, you mention his name and everybody knew who old Jim Hard was. He enjoyed his status as the oldest and finally last Union veteran. He rode in all these parades, and he died in 1953 at the age of 111, just a month short of his 112th birthday. Somebody asked Mr. Hard, "What's your recipe for longevity?" And he said, "Let me think." He said, "Well, don't worry too much. and smoked plenty of cigars. He smoked 8 cigars every day. I met one of his other great-great-grandsons, Larry Exton, and he could remember him. And he said, "Oh, we go into Grandpa Hard's room up at someplace he lived on Portland Avenue, and it was all full of smoke. But we could see his feet down at the bottom of the chair, so we go over and climb up on his lap and suck in some of that smoke, I guess." Anyway, another very interesting book that was written. This gentleman is not from Parma, but he was from Naples, New York, but his descendants live in Parma, and that is Morris Bartlett. And Morris was Kay Twentyman's ancestor, and her sons are Danny and Gary Twentyman, who live in Parma. Danny loaned me his diary, and we made copies of it. And his letters were transcribed in this book form and tell a lot of interesting stories. And I took a couple of excerpts out from what I remember. The first one was on the first page. It said, "I arrived in camp today. A deserter was caught, and I witnessed him sitting on his coffin in front of a firing squad. He was shot and died." It was tough times. Number 2 that I noted, he got to see Abraham Lincoln, and this is what he said. "You see, old Abe came up to see us as we had to march 16 miles to see him. And when we got where he was, we found him no great scratch as to looks after all. The 12th Army Corps was reviewed by him and Hooker. I think he is the neediest looking individual I ever saw for one that occupied such a position as he does." First-hand account. What did people in Parma do while the Civil War was going on? Well, there was a lot of anxiety, of course. People read the newspapers. They couldn't get them fast enough because they would list all the soldiers that had died, and then there would be also war news. And all these people up here had sons and nephews and grandsons who were in the war, and they were, just like we would be today, very, very anxious. There was no radio, no television, no cell phones, no other communications as we have today. Strictly papers, maybe the telegraph. And so the people were anxious. Men went about their business. War enhanced the economy. Food was needed for the troops. So the farmers were doing well, and they needed horses. So raising horses was a big thing, and getting them down to Washington for the army. And war created jobs. Some women went to Philadelphia and Richmond to nurse the wounded. The railroads were very, very busy, carrying troops here and there. Families went to visit soldiers or to retrieve their bodies for burial back home. And sometimes when they would go down, they'd get caught up in the hurly-burly of the war. Some eligible and draftable men paid others to go in their places so they could run their farms and care for their families. Or maybe just didn't feel they had it to become a soldier, but they had to pay, I don't know, I think it was like $800, and some young man would go in their place. The value of history. We should read history as accurately as possible. While research often sheds new light on historical matters, history should not be rewritten for the sake of some political agenda's convenience. We should learn from history and try not to make the same mistakes our predecessors did. Don't tear down statues because some political or social reason. They're part of what happened. And while perhaps offensive to some, they exemplify a role in the action of the day that passed. History can be exciting, informative, and a way to learn from mistakes of the past. They're great stories of courage, social change, and impacts on the future that should be explored within an analytical eye of giving the reader an expanded awareness of the present-day values. The Parma Hilton Historian has an alphabetical listing of the 250 men who signed up in Parma for the Civil War, their rank, company, and age. There are countless books written about the Civil War, illuminating the details and events of both the North and the South. People today are researching their ancestors who fought in the war and learning more details thanks to the U.S. Library of Congress in Washington. The library has digitized the records in their archives so that they're available to the armchair genealogist. Well, that's about all I have, Mike, on the Civil War in Parma. Any questions you have that you want to?
Dave, you were very, very thorough. I wrote about 15 questions before you started, and you've answered basically every one. And the one I had at the end was, what do you think about, modern day with the tearing down of Southern statues or statues in general? And I really appreciate your outlook on that because I think it's a tough subject to breach.
Totally wrong.
I think it is the most bloodiest war America was ever in, too, right?
I would say so, yeah. At least fought on this land. The Revolutionary War wasn't good, but it was much smaller. We didn't have the population that we did almost 100 years later. And while that was bad, there are an awful lot of rough stories about what went on in that war. The Civil War, I would have to say, was the worst. We lost so many people, and they all were Americans that we lost. And I need to say that there were many African Americans that fought in the Civil War, and they did a great job, and their heroics need to be remembered. But you find that out when you read some of the books. And there, as I said, there's a tremendous number of books on the Civil War. It's hard to know which one to read, but as the years go on, it's always good to keep reading about it because new things come out, and it's not to relive it, but it's just to understand what was happening and how it affected our life today. Yeah.
Well, they always say, if you don't pay attention to history, history has a tendency to repeat itself.
Yeah, isn't that for sure?
And I'm really glad we've got you now down on a podcast, and look forward to a future podcast, maybe one on the Revolutionary War and Hilton-Parma's impact.
Well, the Revolutionary War, we didn't have, obviously Parma wasn't even here then, the land was, but we did have Revolutionary War veterans settle in Parma.
Okay.
And that would be an interesting podcast. So.
See, I learned something every day too. Well, this has been Conversations with Crumb with Hilton-Parma historian Mr. David Crumb, and this is Mike Heiss of the Big H Podcast signing off.